According to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore, do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you. But do not follow their example, for they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to carry, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love places of honor at banquets, seats of honor in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces, and the salutation, Rabbi. As for you, do not be called Rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called master. You have but one master, the Christ. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Today's gospel is a very appropriate gospel for this week of National Vocations Awareness. You may notice that there's about 2 times in the year that the church calls us to be aware of vocations, especially to pray and work for priestly and religious vocations. This week, in the first week of November, is National Vocations Awareness Week. Later on, there's an universal, international Vocations Awareness Week. And so there's 2 weeks out of our year that the church calls us to think about and encourage vocations. Today in the gospel, Jesus is speaking about the vocation of the scribes and Pharisees. He is acknowledging that these scribes and Pharisees have been called by God to a true leadership position amongst the Jewish people. That's what he means when he says they have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Not that there's a literal chair. The chair represents the authority. So Jesus is saying that, yes, I acknowledge the scribes and the Pharisees have inherited the legitimate authority of Moses. Even to this day as Catholics, we talk about authority as a chair. That's why the bishop's church is called the cathedral, because inside this church called the cathedral houses the cathedra. The cathedra is the chair, the bishop's chair, which represents the authority of the bishop. So here, Jesus is speaking about the authority of Moses, that the scribes and Pharisees have legitimately inherited. And therefore, because they have inherited this legitimately, Jesus says, therefore obey whatever they teach you, but don't follow their example. Because the scribes and Pharisees during Jesus' time, they were a bunch of hypocrites. And we see that throughout the ministry of Jesus. He was challenging the scribes and Pharisees and calling them out on being hypocrites. And what are hypocrites? Hypocrites are people who say one thing and do another. And this is exactly the very reason why Jesus says, follow what they teach, because what they teach is good. But don't follow their example, because guess what? They don't even practice what they preach. And so he's saying to them, he's acknowledging that, yes, the scribes and the Pharisees have a legitimate call from God, a vocation. That's what the word vocation means, from the Latin word vocare, a calling. That they have a calling from God, but right now, they are not living up to that calling. So yes, do what they're teaching you, but don't follow their example because they themselves are not practicing what they're teaching you. And so therefore we conclude with Jesus saying, then call no man rabbi, call no man father, call no man master. And it is from this particular passage then that sometimes we as Catholics experience objections by non-Catholics saying, see, you Catholics, you're not following the scriptures because you call your priests father. See, Jesus says, call no man father. Jesus is not talking about the usage of titles there, because why? Elsewhere in the scriptures, guess what Jesus allows them to call him? Rabbi, master. Okay? So here he is not talking about the usage of titles, because later on St. Paul himself will tell the Christians, the new Christians of the churches that he founded, I have become your father by giving you spiritual birth, by proclaiming the gospel of life to you. So then what is Jesus talking about? Why is he saying, don't call anyone rabbi, father, or master? Because these three titles were titles of honor that were in usage during Jesus' time. And taken within the context of what Jesus is saying is, he says, why don't you want to follow the example of the scribes and the Pharisees? Because what Jesus is saying is, they act like they're all holy, but they're not practicing what they preach. They act like they're more important than everybody else because they want positions of honor and authority to be seen. And ultimately, what he says is, everything they do, the purpose is so that it can be seen. So Jesus says, ultimately, they are not living up to their vocation as being leaders. Therefore, they don't deserve those titles, rabbi, father, and master, because they're not doing these things for the right reason. And what is the right reason? Jesus concludes with it today. The greatest among you must be your servant. Ultimately, as we reflect on what a vocation is in the church, that ultimately Jesus distills it down, that a vocation, a calling from God, is ultimately to be a servant. So, the main vocations that we concern ourselves today, marriage. How is marriage a call to be a servant? The church teaches us it is through those vows of self-giving that the husband and wife say to each other that they are supposed to live out. You see, they say something, and then they need to practice something. So what do they say? They say, I will take you to myself freely, faithfully, totally, and fruitfully. That's what you married people said to each other. And I will do it for the rest of my life. And the reason why this vocation of marriage then is a service to God and to his church is because ultimately all vocations in the church point to something else. All vocations point to someone else, namely God. And therefore, how does the vocation of marriage point to God? St. Paul says it in the book of Ephesians, that marriage ultimately points to God because the husband stands for Christ and the wife in the marriage stands for the church. And the way that the husband and wife live out their vows to each other points to the way, the sacrificial way, that Christ gives his life up for the church and the church gives up her life for Christ. And that's why marriage is such a vital and important vocation in the church. Today we also talk about religious life. How do the religious men and women who take on the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Those three vows, they also say something, and then therefore they're expected to do something with their life. They have made the solemn profession to take on and live the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. How does that serve God and the church? In poverty, where they practically own nothing, they show that even material goods are passing. And what is the ultimate good? It's the relationship with God. And that practically having nothing causes you to have to be utterly dependent on someone else. You have to be utterly dependent on the church, and you ultimately have to be utterly dependent on God. And the religious who live out this vow, that's the lesson they teach the rest of us. To be utterly dependent on the church and to be utterly dependent on God. Chastity, giving up the good of marriage. I know sometimes people who aren't Catholic, and maybe even some people who are Catholic, look at that as Catholics, we promote marriage, but at the same time, we promote not being married. And that sometimes they think, that seems to be contradictory. Well, it's not. Because while marriage symbolizes that concrete love that God has for us and we are supposed to have for God, chastity, giving up marriage, not marrying, symbolizes this ultimate eternal union that each of us is supposed to have with God. That's what Jesus says. He says some people should not get married. Instead, they should give up the goods of marriage for the sake of the kingdom. And why is that? Because Jesus teaches us that in the kingdom, there will be no marriage and there will be no giving into marriage. Why? Because ultimately, heaven is the eternal union between God and his people. And what Jesus is teaching us is that, therefore, heaven is God permanently marrying his people. And so for those who are celibate, priests and religious, the call of celibacy, the vow of chastity then, is already, the church explains, an earthly example to everyone of something heavenly that is to come. That the life of the celibate is supposed to teach all of us that while human relationships are wonderful, they are good, they're blessed by God, especially the marital relationship. However, that's not necessary. And that fulfillment and joy in life can be attained by a right relationship with God. That's what chastity, the vow of chastity, preaches to the world. And finally, the vow of obedience. Oftentimes, when we speak about vocations to young people, especially teenagers, they think that the hardest vow to keep is that chastity one. But actually, if you speak to us who take on these vows, a lot of us will tell you that the hardest one to keep is obedience. And you kind of know why that is. Because there's something innate in our fallen nature. There's something innate in our fallen nature called concupiscence. That means making it easier to do what is wrong and harder to do what is right. And that's what St. Paul was talking about. In my flesh, I do what I know is wrong, and it's hard for me to do what I know is good. Unfortunately, all of us will struggle with that until we die. And because of that residue of original sin that is in us, obedience is hard. Because while you can give up material things, while you can give up the goods of marriage, now the church wants the religious to give up their will. And usually for us, that's the last thing we want to give up. We don't want other people to tell us what to do. That's the last thing we want to give up. And yet for those who take on the vow of obedience, we are saying to the world and to the rest of the church, hey, you don't know what's best for you all the time. Well, that's true. You don't always know what is best for you. And so, through the practice of obedience, we say and testify to the world, the church knows what is good for us, and God knows what is good for us. And that's a testimony for all of us to learn, that even in our lives, we need to trust in the guidance of Holy Mother Church. And we need to trust in the guidance of God, trusting that He is good and desires our good. And that sometimes, to be able to live that out, it means letting go of what we personally, individually desire, giving that up to obey the will of another higher up, so that ultimately we can learn that it is God's will done in our lives that will win us ultimate peace and salvation. And so now, knowing that, you can see why vocations to marriage, priesthood, religious life are so important. Because these callings from God, they're not careers. We can't think of them in earthly terms. Careers are just simply things that you do to make a living so you can live. But vocations are more than that. A vocation in the church points beyond itself and ultimately points people towards God. And because of that responsibility of vocations, that's why we need vocations. Sometimes people say, maybe we don't need sisters. Maybe we don't need priests. And then the world says, maybe we don't need marriage. The world is practically practicing that. And today the church tells us, no, we need these vocations. They are vital to our existence, because these vocations point us beyond ourselves to God. And so today, as the church makes it apparent to us the need to be aware of these vocations, the church encourages us to do practical things to encourage good and holy vocations amongst our families and amongst our community. And so I say it again, whatever young people you have exposure to in your life this week, make it a point to encourage them to consider, to accept a calling from the Lord to marriage, to priesthood, to religious life, so that through their life and through their actions, that they can serve the Lord and His church by pointing beyond themselves and allowing God to use their life to point others to the kingdom of heaven.